Hey guys. Tonight we're slipping quietly into a place where the air itself feels older than your bones. A medieval forest at the edge of a hunting trail. The kind where shadows look like creatures and creatures look like shadows. You can almost feel the cold pinching at your cheeks already. That sharp kind of chill that makes you think. Very reasonably. Yeah, I definitely wouldn't survive 5 minutes out here. And honestly, you probably wouldn't. Medieval hunters were built differently. Or maybe they were just too tired to care about freezing. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're settling in, tell me where you're listening from tonight. And what time it is over there. I always find it magical how people across the world fall asleep together through these stories. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're stepping off the beaten path now. Boots sinking into a mixture of damp soil and old pine needles. The forest is already exhaling its nighttime breath, that cold, resin-scented wind that runs straight through your cloak like it's gossiping behind your back. Overhead, branches knit together so tightly that even the moonlight needs to file a request before entering. This isn't just any night in the Middle Ages. This is the kind where hunters had to decide quickly whether they would sleep or shiver until dawn. You walk slowly, because the forest sounds different when the temperature drops. Every twig snaps louder, every branch creaks longer, and even your heartbeat seems to echo off the bark. Medieval hunters understood this symphony by instinct. To them, it wasn't spooky ambiance. It was a survival manual. A soft rustle could mean a rabbit, a friend of the dinner pot, a low growl, a wolf, unbothered and unimpressed by human courage. And a sudden silence? That was the forest saying, very politely, good luck staying alive. You push deeper in, following the vague trail left behind by those hunters centuries before you. The air grows sharper, and you feel it biting the tip of your nose, that familiar little warning that nightfall is about to get serious. In medieval Europe, nighttime was practically a separate ecosystem, without insulated tents, without thermal blankets, without the modern joy of complaining about the cold on social media. Hunters had to work with whatever nature provided. Which, tonight, feels like not much. The ground crunches under your feet, a thin crust of frost already forming. Hunters back then knew that if frost had arrived this early in the evening, the night would likely be brutally cold. Some chroniclers even noted that sudden cold snaps could claim a careless man before the stars faded. A bit dramatic. Maybe, but not wrong. You pull your cloak tighter. Grateful you're just imagining this and not actually trying to prove medieval survival skills for real. Ahead of you, between two ancient oaks, is the kind of clearing hunters once used for shelter, flat enough to rest on, elevated enough to stay dry, and surrounded by trees strong enough to block at least some of the wind, assuming the wind was in a good mood. You step into it and instantly feel the temperature dip another notch. Cold loves open spaces. It settles in like an uninvited guest. But medieval hunters learned to work with it, reading the air like we read weather apps. Some even believed that a forest could warn you of the night's severity by how early the animals went quiet. You scan your surroundings, and the forest seems to be holding its breath. A few birds flutter away, heading to safer branches, Somewhere in the distance, a wolf lets out one long howl, the medieval version of "good night." Everyone, you shiver a little, not because you're scared, but because your mind instantly imagines sleeping out here with nothing but a thin cloak and questionable optimism. Medieval hunters didn't have the luxury of doubting themselves. They simply had to trust their instincts. Some even carried charms or carved wooden tokens meant to keep the warmth close. Whether or not they worked, well, historians still argue about that. You kneel down and touch the ground. It's cold, not, wow, chilly, cold. But my hand is now reconsidering its life choices, cold. A medieval hunter wouldn't sleep directly on this. Doing so was practically a one-way invitation to hypothermia. Many accounts mention hunters gathering branches, pine needles, even bundles of dry grass to create a makeshift mat that lifted them a few inches off the frozen earth. You imagine doing that now. Palms full of scratchy pine needles. Trying not to think about whatever tiny creatures also call this place home. A gust of wind drags through the clearing, swirling old leaves into a slow spiral. You wrap your arms around yourself, feeling your breath puff into little white ghosts that disappear almost immediately. The forest is quiet now. Too quiet. Hunters used to say that when the forest falls silent before midnight, the cold is preparing an ambush. It wasn't scientific, but it wasn't wrong either. Silence often meant the temperature was dropping faster than usual. You stand there, letting your senses adjust. You hear the soft cracking of frozen bark contracting, the faint rustle of small animals burrowing deeper for warmth, and the distant complaint of tree trunks swaying under the weight of the cold. For a moment, you feel what those hunters must have felt, the mix of vulnerability and control. Fear and familiarity. They knew the risks, but they also knew the forest better than we know our own neighborhoods. Your breath fogs again. You've been here only a little while, but already the cold seeps through your clothes. A medieval hunter would now be thinking ahead. Where to place a fire, where to sleep, where the wind might shift, and which direction danger might come from. Sleeping in the wild wasn't just about rest. It was about planning every minute of the night like a gentle battle against nature. The sky opens slightly, and a sliver of moonlight finally slips through the canopy, landing on the frost-crusted ground like a silver path. You step into it, your shadow stretching long behind you. The moon was a silent companion for hunters, lighting trails, revealing silhouettes, hinting at approaching weather. Some believed a clear moon meant dry cold. Others believed it meant wolves would be more active. You smile a little, imagining medieval hunters debating lunar meteorology around a campfire the same way people today debate whether pineapple belongs on pizza. Another cold breeze pushes through the trees, curling around your ears like a whisper. You inhale deeply. The forest smells of pine sap, wet earth, and something metallic, the crisp scent of coming frost. You're fully in their world now. A world where warmth wasn't a guarantee and survival meant paying attention to every small detail. You take one last look around the clearing, feeling the cold settle in like a weight on your shoulders. This is the first step of the night, recognizing where you are, what threatens you, and what might save you. Medieval hunters faced this every evening on long expeditions. The moment when the world grew dark, the air grew thin, and their instincts took over. And as you stand there, surrounded by towering trees and silent shadows. You feel the same thing they did, a quiet, steady determination to make it through the night. This is where your journey begins. You're still standing in that clearing, feeling the cold nip at your fingertips, when you realize something the medieval hunters understood instinctively. If you don't set up a sleeping spot before the last light fades, the forest becomes a different creature altogether. And right now, the daylight is slipping away like it's late for an appointment. You take a slow breath, watching it plume out in the dusky air, and you start scanning for the most important thing a hunter needed. A place to settle that wouldn't turn you into an ice sculpture by dawn. Your boots crunch over the frozen ground as you circle the clearing. You can almost hear the old hunters muttering behind you, giving advice in that gruff tone people get when they've done something 1,000 times. Avoid the low ground, they'd say. Cold sinks, dampness collects, and if the ground looks cozy, congratulations, that's a swamp in disguise. You look toward a dip in the earth where a few stubborn tufts of grass are still clinging on. You can tell it's the kind of place that would turn you into a soggy medieval statistic by morning. You step away quickly, as if the ground might personally resent your indecision. Higher terrain is better, not a cliff. You're not trying to sleep on the wind, but a gentle rise. You find one just a few steps from the clearing's edge, beneath a thick-bellied pine whose branches droop like a tired giant offering shelter. That tree matters. Hunters knew that a tree with low branches could break the bite of the wind, intercept falling frost, and even catch stray snowflakes before they landed on your face. Of course, sometimes those branches also dropped frozen clumps straight onto a hunter's nose in the middle of the night. But that's just nature's version of slapstick comedy. You stand beneath the pine and tilt your head upward. The branches knit so tightly that only thin strands of moonlight find their way through, painting silver threads across the forest floor. The needles muffle sound, making the air feel heavier, calmer. You run a gloved hand across the bark, rough, resinous, familiar. Medieval hunters often chose pines for shelter because they shed less water than broadleaf trees, and because their needles made decent bedding when the ground felt like sleeping on a slab of enchanted ice. Some diaries from the period even mention hunters thanking the good pines for their mercy. Historians still dispute whether that gratitude was literal devotion or just exhausted sarcasm. You drop to a knee, pressing your palm again to the earth. Still cold, still unfriendly, but slightly less so under the tree. A medieval hunter would accept this as a small victory, the kind of victory you take when the alternative is freezing stiff like a poorly designed lawn ornament. You start clearing away debris, pushing aside sticks and old needles to make a cleaner space. Your movements are deliberate, slow. The forest around you shifts subtly with each sound you create. When you pause, the silence folds over you again. It's a thick silence, the kind that swallows noise rather than echoing it. Off in the distance, an owl lets out one lonely call, almost sounding irritated at the cold. A soft scurrying passes through the underbrush, something small, probably offended by your presence. The forest at dusk is a negotiation, and medieval hunters were experts at making peace with it. You step back from your chosen spot and observe the surrounding terrain like a medieval architect designing a very low-budget survival hut. The wind direction matters. Right now, It's coming from the north, sharp, steady, unkind. The tree shields you decently, but not perfectly. A hunter would angle their sleeping spot so their back was to the tree. Their cloak wrapped tight, their face turned slightly away from the wind. You imagine that posture now, curled, guarded, but alert enough that every snap of a twig could drag you back from the edge of sleep. You roam another few meters and find a cluster of smaller bushes, not much, but just enough to break the wind on one side. Hunters often used natural growth like this to create small pockets of insulation. The trick wasn't to stop the cold entirely, that was impossible, but to slow it. You position yourself between the pine and the bushes, testing the air with your cheek like medieval meteorology. The relief is subtle but real, enough to matter. Then comes the tricky part, the one every hunter dreaded when they were already tired: gathering the materials to make the ground sleepable. You grab fallen branches, snapping them into smaller lengths. The sound travels through the clearing in crisp echoes. Each crack feels too loud, as if announcing your location to every creature within a mile radius. Medieval hunters joked that breaking branches at night was like ringing a dinner bell for wolves. Historians, again, still debate whether they meant it literally or as a coping mechanism. You layer the branches carefully, creating a rough grid that elevates you off the frozen soil. It's not comfortable. No one has ever laid on a bunch of sticks and said, "Ah yes, luxury," but it stops the cold from wicking your body heat like a medieval thief in the night. On top of the branches, you scatter pine needles and dried leaves. You fluff them up, spreading them evenly, until it begins to resemble a patchy, crunchy nest, somewhere between forest bed and problematic arts and crafts project. You test it with a cautious sit. The branches dip beneath your weight, but they hold. You shift a little, listening for creaks. Nothing threatening. You exhale, relieved in that small, quiet way medieval hunters probably did too. A private moment no one ever wrote down because who brags about not falling through their own bedding? Nearby, you hear the forest change tone. A subtle shift in wind. A faint rustling above. The temperature dips again, and the air feels sharper against your throat. You glance up at the sky. A smear of soft clouds has begun to drift across the moon, turning its silver glow into a faint smudge. Medieval hunters relied on this kind of moonlight for navigation, but they also used it to predict the night's mood. A veiled moon often meant either lighter winds or heavier frost, unfortunately. The forest was rarely courteous enough to clarify which one. You stand once more, brushing the dirt from your gloves. The cold presses closer now, settling around you like an invisible coat you never asked for. But your little clearing, with its pine canopy, raised bedding, and wind block, feels like the beginnings of a home, or at least, a temporary truce. Medieval hunters didn't just choose a spot to sleep. They chose a place to trust the night wouldn't break them. And as you take in the dim landscape, the hushed trees, the waiting cold, you feel that quiet resolve building in your chest. You have a place now, a foothold, a tiny island of intention against the wilderness. And soon, you'll have to make it warm enough to survive. You settle into your newly chosen spot, the air tightening around you like a cold hand closing gently, but not kindly, over your shoulders. The forest is shifting into its night voice now. Lower, heavier, as if speaking in a language only the ancient trees can fully understand. And as you sit quietly, letting your breath drift into fading daylight, you begin to notice something medieval hunters depended on more than tools or muscle: the soundscape of the wild. The forest at night isn't silent. It's never silent. It's a living orchestration of whispers, cracks, sighs, and warnings. The trick is to know which is which. You lean back slightly, your weight sinking into the uneven bedding you've made. It crunches softly beneath you, just enough to remind you that this isn't a feather mattress. It's a survival strategy held together by optimism and plant material. You close your eyes for a moment, letting your ears take the lead. Immediately, the forest greets you with a chorus of layered sounds: the distant hoot of an owl, the soft rustle of tiny feet in the underbrush, and the restless groaning of tall pines bending under the weight of cold air. You open your eyes again, because some of those sounds are comforting. Yes, but others? Others require your full attention. A medieval hunter listening to these same sounds would be parsing them like lines in a sacred text. They knew what each note meant. A brush of leaves could be a rabbit, but it could also be something larger trying very hard not to be heard. A sharp crack might be a falling branch, or a paw stepping down on old wood with intent. Hunters develop the skill the way we develop muscle memory: repetition, need, and a healthy desire not to be eaten. You tilt your head, focusing on the strongest sound first: the wind moving through the canopy. It's not angry, not yet. More like a restless traveler flowing between the branches, shifting direction every few minutes. Medieval hunters called this the forest breathing. Some believed the temperature could be guessed by how the wind exhaled. Fast gusts meant colder air dropping in from far-off places. Slow, steady breezes meant the night would settle but not deepen drastically. You listen now, trying to make sense of it, though it mostly sounds like nature sighing dramatically. You smirk a little at the thought. The forest does seem like the type to sigh loudly when humans show up. But beneath the wind, you catch something else: a faint, repetitive tapping high above, as if a small creature is knocking politely on a branch. You stiffen, then relax as your mind catches up. Many hunters noted the same sound: tree branches contracting in sudden cold. The wood tightens, tiny cracks forming in the bark like stretching joints. In some accounts, hunters even mistook this for footsteps in the treetops, right up until they realized they were arguing with physics. Still, you keep listening. Another sound edges its way into the mix: a distant, low hum, not mechanical, not human. It's the sound of the forest settling into a temperature shift. Leaves stiffen, frost forms, branches hold still. Temperature changes make their own quiet vibration. And although you've probably never consciously listened for it, medieval hunters certainly did. They could tell when frost was coming by this subtle tightening. And frost is coming tonight. You feel it in your bones already. Then, the forest gives you a new sound, a heavier rustling from the direction of the clearing you passed through earlier. You freeze for an instant, muscles going taut. Whatever is moving out there is heavier than a rabbit. Not heavy enough to break branches, but heavy enough to matter. Your pulse quickens, though medieval hunters would probably laugh at how slowly it does so. This is where their instincts kicked in. They classified threats by sound alone. A steady, Deliberate rustle meant a deer or boar, creatures with weight and confidence. A soft, cautious rustle meant a fox or lynx. A sloppy, crunch-heavy rustle, well, that usually meant something clumsy and hungry. Wolves moved quietly, with elegant precision. Bears did not care for elegance. The forest is still now, waiting, watching with 1,000 invisible eyes. You narrow your own eyes toward the dark edge of the clearing. But you see nothing. That's another thing the hunters knew. You don't always see the animal first. You hear it, you locate it, you decide whether it cares about you. The rustling fades after a moment, replaced again by the wind. Whatever it wasn't coming closer. Probably a deer, possibly a fox. You quietly hope it wasn't evaluating you like a midnight snack option. You shift position, and your bedding crunches again. The sound feels oddly loud in contrast to the forest's cautious whispers. Nearby, a branch snaps loudly, a sharp, cracking bark that echoes through the trees. Your entire body tenses, because that was not the sound of bark contracting. That was movement. You hold your breath. Silence answers you. Slow, deliberate silence. Medieval hunters believed that the forest only speaks when it wants to be understood. When it goes still, utterly still, it means something is listening to you. Hunters told stories around campfires of wolves that moved like smoke through the trees. Silent except for the occasional break of a weak branch. They exaggerated, surely, but not by much. Even today, wolves are notoriously hard to track by sound. The silence stretches. You exhale quietly, barely letting the air escape. Then, from deeper in the woods, a long, low howl threads through the cold. It vibrates through the trees, echoing in soft waves. Not angry, not hunting, just communicating. A wolf telling the world, I'm here, and this is my night. Medieval hunters heard this constantly. It wasn't always a threat, but it was always a reminder. You were never alone out here. The forest belonged to many creatures, and humans were temporary guests with poor accommodations. You listen to the howl fade into the distance. Your shoulders relax. A small part of you even smiles. There's something strangely comforting about knowing the wolves aren't right next to you. A little distance goes a long way for emotional well-being. Another layer of sound enters the forest's night symphony, the soft tapping of thawing droplets falling from high branches. That means some pockets of the forest are warmer, letting moisture drip down. Hunters used this sound to guess how cold different areas were. If the tapping stopped, it meant freeze-over had begun everywhere, and that was a sign to prepare for a long, brutally still night. You feel the air tightening again, settling. The forest is reducing itself to essentials, the wind, the distant animals, the slight creak of tall trees adjusting their weight. At this point in the night, medieval hunters slowed their breathing and became part of the soundscape. Listening wasn't just practical, it was survival. And as you sit there, letting the forest breathe around you, you experience the same mixture they felt, that strange blend of alertness and calm. Fear and belonging. You're not just in the night now. You're inside it, wrapped in its voice. Listening as medieval hunters once did, waiting to understand what the darkness wants to tell you next. You stay seated beneath the pine for a moment, letting the last echoes of the forest's night music settle in your chest. The cold is thickening now, Slipping between layers of fabric like it's auditioning for a role is most annoying natural phenomenon. And medieval hunters knew exactly what that meant. If you didn't get a fire going soon, you were going to spend the night with your teeth chattering until they filed for divorce. So you rise slowly, stretching your stiff legs. Your breath puffs out in pale clouds, drifting away and dissolving into the chilled air. The clearing around you is darker now, not pitch black, but dim enough that everything looks one shade closer to ominous. You can almost imagine a medieval hunter standing where you stand, arms folded, giving you that silent look that means, well, don't just stand there, start the fire. Medieval fires weren't just sources of warmth. They were companions, guardians, and sometimes, as old stories claim, negotiators between humans and the night. Without them, even the bravest hunter felt the cold creeping into their bones in ways you simply can't shrug off. Try sleeping in freezing air without heat, and you'd quickly understand why so many medieval diaries treat fire starting like a sacred ritual. You kneel near the base of the pine, brushing aside the sparse, frosty needles. The ground here is mostly dry. Thank the forest for small mercies, and dry ground makes your job infinitely easier. Still, you're not naive enough to assume anything in a medieval forest is going to cooperate without a little effort. You begin gathering kindling first, then twigs, delicate pine needles, strips of bark peeling from fallen branches. You snap them gently, listening to the crisp, brittle sound that signals they're dry enough to burn. Damp wood in winter is a cruel prank of nature. Medieval hunters hated it with a level of passion normally reserved for rival kingdoms. Some even kept special pouches of dried fungus or shaved bark to use as emergency tinder. Whether that was common practice or exaggerated storytelling is a matter historians still debate. You pile the kindling carefully, forming a small nest. It looks fragile, like a sleeping bird, and now comes the moment every medieval hunter dreaded on cold nights: coaxing a spark into flame. Fire wasn't guaranteed, no matter how skilled you were. One gust of wind, one hidden patch of moisture, one badly timed sneeze, and your evening's hopes went out the window. You reach for your imagined medieval flint and steel, the tools that shaped countless cold nights. Flint strikes steel, sending bright sparks cascading like tiny falling stars. Each impact echoes softly through the trees. You aim the sparks into the waiting nest of kindling, watching the brief glimmers fade before catching anything substantial. Another strike. Another spark. Another brief moment of hope. A third strike brings a longer flash, and this time the spark lands just right, settling into the thin curl of bark. You hold your breath as the ember glows. Fragile and desperate, it flickers, dims, then glows brighter as you shield it with your body from the wind. A soft curl of smoke rises, not much, but something. You lean forward and blow gently, feeling the cold air return as warmth against your lips. The ember catches. The bark darkens, curls inward, then bursts into a tiny flame. You smile, relieved in a way that feels deeply human, the same relief medieval hunters must have felt when darkness finally gave them permission to breathe again. The flame grows, licking upward, catching the pine needles, then the small twigs. You feed it slowly, carefully, letting it strengthen before adding anything larger. The forest responds almost instantly to the new presence of light and warmth. The shadows pull back slightly, as if irritated by the sudden brightness. Stray beams of firelight shimmer against frost-covered bark, turning the clearing into a mixture of silver and gold. Somewhere deeper in the woods, a creature scurries away. Some animals don't like fire, and others are simply too smart to approach it. As the fire grows, you sit close, extending your hands toward it. The warmth hits your fingertips first, then spreads slowly into your palms, like a polite guest making conversation before settling in. Medieval hunters often described this sensation in poetic ways, the fire unfreezing the blood, the flame speaking comfort to the bones. Things like that. One hunter even wrote about a fire, singing warmth back into my stubborn fingers. Which is either beautifully descriptive or the earliest form of frostbite-induced hallucination. You add thicker branches now, letting them crack under the heat. Sparks jump and dance upward, disappearing into the dark canopy. The flames sway, casting a soft orange glow across your improvised bedding. The cold is still out there, but the fire creates a small bubble of comfort, a fragile circle where survival feels less like a battle and more like an agreement. You lean closer, watching the flames twist and curl. Fire has a way of hypnotizing you, pulling your thoughts inward. Medieval hunters were no strangers to that feeling. Sitting by the flames, they told stories, tales of hunts gone wrong, of beasts half believed and half feared, of nights colder than anyone wanted to admit. Some even claimed that firelight revealed truths hidden in the dark. Whether they meant literal truths or psychological ones, well, you can guess which side historians argue about. A sharp pop from the fire interrupts your thoughts. A resin pocket bursts, sending a tiny spray of sparks upward. You flinch instinctively. Hunters back then probably would have flinched too, no matter how experienced you were. A surprise spark to the nose was never pleasant. But this time the forest doesn't respond with silence. Instead, the wind shifts gently, bringing with it the sound of distant branches rattling. You listen to the fire crackle, to the wind hum, to the night whisper. The warmth spreads further, into your arms, your shoulders, your face. Your cheeks feel alive again. Your nose stops aching. A medieval hunter might have held their hands to the fire until they bordered on too warm. Desperate to bank just enough heat before sleep claimed them. And they never wasted the fire's energy. They used it to dry wet clothes, heat stones, cook small scraps of food, and, most importantly, to guard against the cold that tried constantly to reclaim them. Some hunters believed that fire also warded off spirits roaming the woods. And while that sounds dramatic, it's not hard to imagine believing something like that when you're alone, freezing, and listening to strange noises just beyond the tree line. But for now, you have warmth, a companion, a flickering heartbeat in the heart of a dangerous night. You stretch your hands toward the flames again, feeling the boundary between misery and comfort tilt slowly in your favor. This is the hunter's oldest friend, the fire that stays awake so you can rest. And you're going to need it, because the night is only just beginning, and the cold has many more tricks waiting in the trees. You sit close to the fire for a while, letting its warmth seep gradually into your bones, softening the cold's grip on your body. But medieval hunters knew something you're starting to understand too. fire alone wasn't enough. Not when the ground beneath you could steal your heat faster than the flames could give it back. And certainly not when the night was sharpening its teeth, ready to bite down as soon as you drifted into sleep. So now you turn to the next challenge, building a bed that won't freeze you from below. You rise slowly, feeling the stiffness in your legs, and take a step back from the fire. The warmth fades immediately, replaced by the colder, truer air of the forest. Your breath forms pale clouds again, drifting upward like tiny spirits escaping from your lungs. You look down at the rough platform of branches and pine needles you made earlier. It's workable, but workable wasn't good enough for medieval hunters, when the difference between life and death was a matter of inches. They knew that even a crude bed had to be crafted with intention. You crouch beside it, pressing your palm lightly onto the layered branches. They give a little beneath your weight, but you can feel the cold lurking underneath. Hungry, medieval hunters perfected this trick, elevating themselves above ground to avoid conductive heat loss, though of course, they didn't call it that. They called it keeping the cold from drinking your warmth, which honestly feels much more accurate. You begin improving the design, pulling thicker branches from nearby piles. The forest floor provides generously fallen limbs, snapped twigs, scattered needles. This part of the work is simple, almost meditative. The twigs crack easily, some so brittle they crumble in your fingers. The larger pieces require a bit more force, and the sound of each break echoes faintly through the clearing like small, sharp fireworks. As you work, you can imagine how medieval hunters did this with practiced rhythm, often by moonlight, sometimes with fingers stiff from cold. Some records mention hunters racing the dusk, trying to build their makeshift beds before their hands became too numb to tie knots or snap branches. Others mention hunters singing softly while they worked, not because it warmed them, but because silence made the cold feel heavier. You spread out the branches more evenly now, creating a raised lattice that lifts your future sleeping spot several inches off the ground. Then you scoop up handfuls of pine needles, dry leaves, anything that looks vaguely soft or at least less hard than wood. You scatter them across the branches, building layers the way a bird might build a nest for someone extremely large and extremely ungraceful. The bedding begins to take shape, uneven, lumpy, a bit sad-looking, but functional. Medieval hunters weren't aiming for comfort, they were aiming for survival. Though, to be fair, some hunters did brag about their bedding the way people today brag about memory foam mattresses. One old account describes a hunter declaring he had slept as warm as a boar in its winter den, which is either a compliment or an insult depending entirely on how you feel about boars. You sit on the mattress again, testing it carefully. It creaks, it shifts, but it holds your weight. The insulation is surprisingly effective, not luxurious, but noticeably less icy. The cold beneath the branches still exists, but it no longer feels like it's plotting against your internal organs. A gust of wind cuts across the clearing, and you instinctively wrap your cloak tighter around your shoulders. The fire wavers behind you, flickering like a startled animal. Shadows jump across the trees, stretching tall and thin, reminding you that the night is only growing deeper. You add more needles to the bedding, fluffing them with your fingers. The smell of pine fills the air, sharp, clean, almost comforting. Medieval hunters often associated that scent with safety, or at least with the promise of not freezing to death. Pine needles were a gift from the forest, and many hunters believed they were sacred for that reason alone. Some even carried bundles of them in their packs to use in emergencies. You smooth out the top layer with your palm, pressing down gently to spread the softer material. The mattress feels serviceable, not cozy, but survivable, and that's all a medieval hunter asked for. When you sit back on your heels, admiring your work, the forest shifts again. A distant crack of wood echoes through the trees, louder this time. Not the polite, temperature-induced snapping of branches, but something heavier. A creature stepping somewhere out in the dark. You pause, listening with all the focus the night demands. Silence answers you at first. Then a faint rustle. Not close, not threatening, just the forest reminding you that it's full of life. Most of which would prefer you didn't exist in its bedroom. Medieval hunters had to accept that reality. Every night outdoors was shared with other inhabitants. Some harmless, some not. You turn back to the bed and make one final adjustment, adding a layer of bark across the top to create a partial moisture barrier. Hunters used whatever they could find to prevent nighttime dew from soaking into their bedding. Wet insulation was no insulation at all. And while your setup isn't perfect, it's enough to make the night survivable. You sit down fully now, settling into the uneven but comforting nest you've built. The branches shift slightly, the needles rustle, and a faint scent of earth and pine rises with the movement. Beneath you, the cold is muted, not gone, but softened, less intrusive. Your fire crackles warmly nearby, throwing a wash of orange light over your bedding. You can feel the warmth touching your side, like a friendly hand pressed against your arm. Medieval hunters positioned their beds close to the fire for exactly this reason, not too close, or sparks would turn you into a cautionary tale, but close enough that the radiant heat made the difference between rest and misery. You lie back slowly, feeling the branches hold you up, the needles cushioning you in their own prickly, lopsided way. The night is cold, yes, but you've carved out a small sanctuary for yourself. A fragile cradle of warmth and intention in a forest that couldn't care less whether you make it to dawn. And as the fire crackles, and the wind sighs, and the world grows darker around you, you understand something medieval hunters knew deep in their bones. A good bed in the wild isn't a luxury. It's a declaration that you plan to survive the night. You lie back for a moment on your pine needle bed, feeling the fire's warmth reaching toward you in faint, wavering fingers. But medieval hunters knew something you're already beginning to sense. Even a raised bed and a well-fed fire wouldn't keep you warm once the night reached its coldest point. Heat was precious, and it slipped away faster than you could hold it. And no matter how optimistic your bedding looked, you weren't going to survive the night with just thin fabric and good intentions. That's why medieval hunters relied on one of their oldest tools, the cloak of fur draped around their shoulders like a loyal companion. You sit up again, pulling the imaginary cloak tighter around your body. The fur brushes against your neck, coarse in some places, soft in others. Hunters made these cloaks from animals they depended on for survival: wolf, fox, deer, or even bear if they were lucky enough to have one and brave enough to admit it. Fur wasn't fashion, it was insulation, protection, armor against the cold. And tonight, You understand exactly why. The moment the cloak wraps around you, the air feels different, the cold still touches you. But it doesn't bite as deeply. The fur traps pockets of warm air close to your skin, building a quiet barrier that medieval hunters trusted more than any other piece of gear they owned. Some hunters even named their cloaks, treating them like reliable friends. Whether that was sentimentality or sheer desperation is something historians continue to debate. You run your fingers along the fur, feeling the texture, thick, dense, smelling faintly of forest, smoke, and something animalistic. Medieval cloaks weren't clean in the modern sense. They carried the scent of the wilderness, the hunts, the struggles, the storms they'd endured, but that scent told a story. And it gave hunters a strange comfort. The cloak had survived as much as they had. It wasn't merely worn, it was lived in. You stand and turn slightly, letting the cloak sweep around your shoulders. When you face the fire again, the flames cast a warm sheen over it, giving the fur a deep copper glow. You kneel beside the fire to warm it further. Because medieval hunters often heated their cloaks directly before sleeping, not because the warmth lasted long, but because those first few minutes of heated fabric were pure bliss, a brief reminder of comfort before the cold reclaimed everything. A gust of wind swirls through the clearing, tugging at your hood. You pull it up, tucking your ears beneath the fur. Immediately, you hear the world differently, muffled, closer, safer. Hunters often slept with their hoods up to protect their ears. Because frostbite wasn't a dramatic threat, it was a simple, quiet, everyday danger. You sit back on your bedding and wrap the cloak fully around you, folding the edges beneath your legs. This transforms it into something more important than a cloak, a primitive sleeping bag. Medieval style. Hunters tucked themselves inside their cloaks, sealed the openings with careful folds, and curled their bodies tight to conserve warmth. You mimic the motion now, and suddenly the bed feels less exposed. The cloak becomes its own tiny shelter, a cocoon against the night. The forest wind shifts again, sliding across the clearing in a slow, icy ribbon. It brushes your face like a cold hand searching for weakness. But the cloak holds its ground. The fur absorbs the wind's bite, leaving only a cool whisper against your cheeks. You feel the warmth from the fire filtering into the cloak's fibers, soaking into your shoulders and spreading through your chest. And now, with the cloak wrapped tight, you begin to understand how hunters felt during nights like this, half exposed, half protected, sitting on the edge between danger and comfort. Medieval hunters respected their cloaks. They maintained them through rain and snow, mended torn seams with bone needles, brushed out ice crystals before they could stiffen the fur. A neglected cloak was a death sentence waiting for the right night. You stroke your own now, imagining what it must have been like to rely on a single garment so completely. You shift your weight, curling deeper into the fur. The warmth is building slowly inside the cocoon you've created. But beyond the fire's glow, the forest stirs with small reminders that predators, too, knew how to survive the cold. A distant branch cracks, deliberate, heavy. You freeze. It might be a boar rooting for food. It might be something bigger. Medieval hunters slept with one ear open at all times, trusting the cloak to keep them warm but relying on their senses to keep them alive. You listen closely, breath held. waiting for the next sound. Silence. Then another crack, softer this time, followed by the faint crunch of snow. Something moving, but not toward you. You relax again, though only slightly. You nestle deeper into the cloak and pull the edges toward your chin, leaving just enough space to breathe. The fire pops behind you, tossing sparks upward like tiny fleeing spirits. You lean forward and adjust a log on the fire. The flames rise, licking higher. The heat intensifies, washing over the fur and warming your face. Medieval hunters used this moment wisely, turning their cloaks to absorb heat evenly. Kneeling close enough to capture warmth without letting the fire singe the fur. Hunters joked that if you burned a hole in your cloak, you'd be warmer for 4 seconds and colder forever after. You shift your cloak again, letting the fire's warmth soak into the back this time. The heat feels like a slow wave, sinking through the fur layer by layer. You close your eyes briefly, savoring it, with the cloak fully enveloping you. The fire becomes more than warmth, it becomes a partner, completing the fragile balance needed to survive the night. You settle back onto your bed, curling your knees toward your chest, tucking your hands beneath the fur. The cloak's interior holds the warmth your body generates, and the fire offers an external glow to counter the cold creeping from the ground. But here's the truth medieval hunters learned the hard way. Even wrapped in fur and warmed by flames, they sometimes woke up shaking uncontrollably, their bodies battling the cold that seeped in from every angle. So they adapted. Some slept lightly, repositioning themselves the moment they felt their heat slipping. Others heated stones in the fire to tuck beneath their cloaks. And a few, the more superstitious, whispered little charms into the fur, begging it to remember warmth and hold it close. Whether this actually worked or was just a desperate promise mumbled into the night, well, historians still argue about that. You shift again, feeling the cloak hug your body more tightly. The fur muffles the sound of the wind, softening the world into something quieter, gentler. The fire crackles steadily beside you, a steady guardian, its glow dancing across the frost-tipped trees. And for the first time tonight, the cold feels manageable, not an enemy, but a presence you've negotiated with. The cloak is doing its job. And you feel, for a moment, like one of those hunters, breathing slow, bundled in fur, lying on a bed built from the forest itself. You're not fully safe, but you're prepared. And in the medieval wilderness, that was often the closest thing to comfort they ever knew. The fire sways gently at your side, its warmth pulsing in soft waves. But already you can feel the cold regrouping, gathering strength in the shadows beyond the clearing. Medieval hunters knew this pattern all too well. Fire wasn't a victory over the night, just a temporary truce, and one the wind was always eager to break. And tonight, that wind is sharpening again, threading between the branches like a thin, icy blade. You shift inside your fur cloak, turning your back toward the fire, not to ignore it, but to test something every hunter had to judge: how much of the wind your shelter actually blocks. You feel the air drift around the pine trunk, sliding against your shoulder. Even through the fur, the cold is unmistakable. It presses against you with the confidence of a force that knows it always wins eventually. And that's why medieval hunters never relied on one barrier alone. You rise from your makeshift bed and take a few steps around the pine tree. your boots crunching over the frosted forest floor. The firelight trails behind you but doesn't follow completely, beyond a few meters. The warmth disappears as if swallowed by the darkness. Here, the wind feels different, stronger, more direct. It rushes past your ears with a low hiss, slipping beneath the tree line and curling around your legs like cold smoke. Hunters would never sleep in the open like this. They needed layers of protection. You turn and face your campsite with new awareness. The pine has offered some shelter. Yes, its thick branches catching falling frost. Its trunk blocking wind from one side. But the forest is full of shifting currents. And not all of them respect your planning. Tonight, the wind is sneaking in from an angle you didn't account for. So you step toward a cluster of nearby bushes, low, dense, leafless in the winter cold, but still sturdy enough to matter. You run your hand along the branches. They bend but do not break. Perfect. Medieval hunters often used shrubs like these to create a secondary windbreak. Not for beauty, though in the firelight they cast elegant patterns of shadow, but for practicality. Blocking even a fraction of the wind could make the difference between rest and a long, miserable night. You drag a few fallen branches closer, propping them in a rough angle between the pine trunk and the bushes. The branches interlock with a satisfying scratch, forming a crude barrier. It's far from pretty. If you built something like this in modern times, someone would smile politely and offer to show you how real shelters are made. But to a medieval hunter, this would earn a nod of approval. The goal wasn't aesthetics. The goal was survival. You crouch and test the airflow again. Less wind, not gone, but gentler, like the forest is whispering instead of shouting. You adjust the angle slightly, pushing a heavier log into place for reinforcement. The wind pushes back for a moment, tugging at the branches, but eventually settles, flowing around your structure instead of through it. As you work, you remember how hunters often used whatever they could find: animal hides, loose bark, clusters of rocks, even snow piled into low mounds. One account describes a hunter creating a half-circle of logs so skillfully that his companions nicknamed it the wooden embrace. Another story claims that a hunter used his own broken sled as a windbreak after a disastrous winter chase. Whether that's true or exaggerated is something historians still argue about. You step back and admire your little construction. It's crooked, uneven, and absolutely essential. Medieval hunters weren't perfectionists, they were pragmatists. They understood the wind in ways we've mostly forgotten: how it moves, how it curls, how it steals warmth from anything foolish enough to stand still. You move behind your new barrier, wrapping your cloak tightly again. The difference is immediate. A soft pocket of stillness forms around you. Fragile but real. The fire's warmth reaches your back more easily now. No longer scattered by the wind. The air feels calmer, the cold less aggressive. You settle onto your bed once more and let the cloak envelop you. The fur presses against your cheek, warm where the fire touched it, cool where the wind kissed it. You breathe slowly, feeling the night ease its grip just slightly. But the forest doesn't stay quiet for long. A gust of wind crashes through the upper branches of the trees, shaking loose a small flurry of frost. It falls around you like tiny, glittering shards, landing softly on your cloak. You brush a few away, watching them melt instantly from the heat of your hand. Medieval hunters used moments like this to judge how well their shelter was working. If frost didn't land directly on their sleeping spot, they considered it a success. You pull the cloak tighter around your shoulders. Out in the dark, something moves, a rustle, a crunch, a quick, darting sound, probably a fox, maybe a lynx. Either way, the animal moves with purpose, passing you by without interest. You're not a meal, you're just another part of the landscape tonight. The windbreak holds steady, and the fire continues its steady crackle. You can feel the warmth wrapping around your ribs, sinking deeper into the folds of your cloak. You stretch your legs slightly, feeling the stiffness ease. The cold isn't gone, it never truly leaves, but it's manageable now. Tamed by layers of strategy woven from instinct, experience, and the quiet ingenuity of hunters who lived centuries before you. You lean against the pine trunk, letting your head rest against the rough bark. The wind brushes your face again, but only lightly, like a passing thought instead of a threat. Your shelter has done its job. And in that moment, you feel something medieval hunters must have felt too, that fleeting, precious sense of having outsmarted the night, even if only for a little while. You're tucked between tree and fire, wrapped in fur, shielded from the wind. A small island of warmth. A brief moment of safety. And the cold, for now, keeps its distance. You settle back into the quiet pocket of warmth created by your fire. Your fur cloak, and the makeshift windbreak you built with stubborn determination. For a moment, the forest feels almost gentle, as if the cold has stepped back to observe you rather than attack you. But medieval hunters never let this brief calm fool them. They knew the night wasn't just about the cold. It was about the creatures moving through that darkness with silent paws and sharper instincts. And tonight, the forest is very much awake. You shift slightly on your raised bed, adjusting the cloak around your shoulders. The fire crackles softly beside you, its glow flickering over the trunks of nearby trees. Those same flames that comfort you also make you visible, a glowing, warm target in a world where predators rely on darkness and shadows. You listen again. You've listened all night, but the forest's tone changes now. The ambient rustles have grown more deliberate, more rhythmic. Something is moving out there, and it's moving with purpose. A medieval hunter lying where you lie now would be thinking about wolves. Not the dramatic, snarling wolves of modern movies, but real ones, patient, cautious, social. They rarely attacked humans outright. But a sleeping hunter alone in winter could be an opportunity too tempting for a starving pack. Hunters said wolves studied the flame, watching from the tree line just beyond its glow. You get the unsettling sense that something could be doing that right now. You raise your head slightly and look toward the edge of the firelight. Nothing moves. The darkness seems unbroken, but then, the forest isn't generous with information. You hear a crunch, faint, deliberate, followed by silence. Whatever is out there is testing the air. Testing you. You shift again, clutching the cloak tighter, letting the fur absorb your trembling breath. You remind yourself of what medieval hunters always repeated. Most creatures fear fire. Fire is your ally, and that's true. Mostly, wolves keep their distance, unless hunger pushes them too hard. Boars avoid flames, unless panicked. Bears wander through forests even on cold nights, unless they're hibernating. And even then, hibernation isn't a promise, just a hope. A sudden rustling from the right jolts you upright. Not frantic, not aggressive, controlled, like something walking in a wide arc around your camp. You freeze, breath caught in your throat. As the sound fades into the wind, the fire pops loudly, shattering the tension. You blink, startled, then almost laugh under your breath at your own reaction. Medieval hunters joked that the fire sometimes scared them more than predators did, because sparks had a habit of flying directly at cloaks that took weeks to make. You brush a few glowing embers off your sleeve just in case. No way you're burning a hole through your only warm layer tonight. But the forest isn't done with you. A few minutes later, another sound reaches you, this time from behind. A slow, steady crunch. Not a deer. Deer move more lightly, with that airy grace you always wish you had while trying to be quiet in the woods. This is something heavier, pressing its weight into the frozen ground. Your heart beats a little faster. You tilt your head, listening hard. The cloak muffles the sound slightly, so you pull it back from one ear, letting in the sharper cold so the forest's whispers become clear again. There it is, a soft snort, a scraping sound. You swallow. Boar. Medieval hunters feared boars far more than wolves. A wolf pack might follow you, observe you, evaluate you, but a wild boar could charge without warning, fueled by a mix of territorial instinct and perpetual annoyance at the world. And a boar in winter was even more unpredictable. Hungry, defensive, irritable. You stay still, absolutely still. The boar is close, but not too close, maybe 20 yards away, rooting beneath a tree for leftover acorns or frozen bulbs. You realize, with a flicker of relief, that it probably doesn't know you're here. The wind is in your favor, blowing your scent away from it. You breathe as shallowly as you can, letting the moment pass. After a few tense minutes, the noises drift away. The boar wanders off, bored or disappointed or both. You let out a slow breath, sinking deeper into your cloak and feeling your pulse return to something less dramatic. Of course, medieval hunters often relied on more than luck. Some slept with crude tripwires around their camps, strands of gut or rope tied to noisy objects like metal buckles or dried branches. Others used their dogs as sentinels, knowing that a good hunting dog could sense danger before any human ear caught the first faint sound. And some hunters simply slept with one hand gripping a knife, a spear, or even a heavy stick. You glance at the nearest sturdy branch. If you had to swing it, you could, though you're not exactly radiating medieval confidence right now. But even fear has its place. Hunters understood that fear kept them alive. Fear kept them listening, aware, responsive, and eventually, fear taught them what mattered most during nights like this: being part of the forest. Not fighting against it, understanding its sounds, respecting its rhythms, trusting that the fire, the cloak, the windbreak, and instinct could carry them through until dawn. The forest shifts again, but this time the sounds are gentle, small feet scampering, owls calling, leaves rattling softly. The boar has passed, the tension thins, and you feel the cold return as the primary threat, slipping back into your awareness after the adrenaline fades. You curl into your bed again, adjusting your cloak so that only your nose peeks out from the hood. The fire's light flickers across the trees, and you imagine wolves in the distance watching that glow. Cautious and curious but keeping their distance. Probably smart enough to let you have your tiny, warm island in the dark. You settle deeper, your back warmed by flames, your front shielded from wind, your ears alert. The night is dangerous, wild, unpredictable. But with every sound you interpret, every flicker of light you tend, every rustle you learn to ignore, you feel a little more like the medieval hunters who once slept in forests just like this. Not fearless, but prepared. Not safe, but surviving. And in the medieval world, that was everything. The forest settles back into its careful quiet, the kind that feels almost polite after the chaos of moments ago. But medieval hunters knew this silence wasn't peace, not really. It was simply the night reorganizing itself, returning to its natural rhythm after a brief disturbance. And as your heartbeat calms and your breath softens, you begin to notice something else creeping into your awareness. The fire is weakening, not collapsing, not dying, but shrinking, responding to a deeper cold settling over the clearing, the kind of cold that presses down like a weight. You shift upright, rubbing warmth back into your hands before leaning closer to the flames. The logs you added earlier are still burning, but their edges are rimmed with a thin crust of white frost. You blink at it, almost disbelieving, but there it is. Frost forming on burning wood. Medieval hunters recorded nights exactly like this, when the cold was so sudden and sharp it clung to anything not directly in the fire's core. Your breath hovers in front of you longer than before, swirling slowly instead of fading quickly. You can feel the cold probing at your fire, siphoning off its heat, testing your resilience the way it once tested the men and women who hunted these forests centuries ago. You pull your cloak tighter around you and get to work. The fire needs fuel, not just to grow, but to survive. You reach for the stack of wood you gathered earlier, now lightly glazed with frost, and place a thick log near the base of the flame. It hisses as the frost melts, sending up a tiny cloud of steam. Then you place another, and another. Hunters always said that in a cold snap, firewood drank heat before giving it back. It seems they were right. But you quickly notice a new problem. The firewood is wet. Not from snow or rain, but from dew freezing before it touches the ground. The cold is so intense and so rapid that moisture in the air is condensing and turning to ice on the logs. That means the fire will struggle, and so will you. You kneel closer, rotating the logs carefully, angling them so that the driest edges face the flame. The fire responds slowly, crackling in short, sharp bursts. You rub your hands together and bring them near the fire, feeling the heat fight its way outward against the invading cold. Medieval hunters had a trick for this too. They used feather sticks, shaving curls of wood from a dry log's inner layers to create thin, papery slivers that caught fire easily. You pick up one of the driest logs you can find, turn it over, and imagine drawing a small blade down its surface, curling shavings outward like delicate scrolls. Hunters warmed those curls with their breath, then coaxed them into flame with sparks. It worked then. It would work now. But even as you perform the motions in your mind, you hear a familiar, troubling sound. Another crack slices through the trees. At first, you think it's bark contracting again, but this one is lower, deeper, more resonant, a heavy branch giving way under the weight of frost. You look up instinctively. The treetops shimmer, pale silver under the moonlight, coated with tiny crystals. Frost spreads across the needles and branches like a glittering net. It's beautiful, almost breathtaking, and deadly. Because frost this heavy means moisture everywhere. Moisture that will cling to your bedding. Moisture that will stiffen your cloak. Moisture that will turn every tool, every stick, every part of your shelter into a frozen version of itself. You brush your hand across your pine needle bed and feel the cold instantly. Numbing your skin, the needles have stiffened, the leaves crackle like shards of glass. You quickly shake off as much frost as you can, sweeping it away in sharp motions. Medieval hunters did the same, though many complained their beds awoke colder than their dreams. You peer at your windbreak next. The branches you propped earlier now glitter with thin ice, making them heavier and less effective. You stand, cloak wrapped tight, and move to inspect it. When you press your palm to one of the branches, ice flakes off like fragile scales. The cold is winning again. You reposition a few branches, tightening gaps where the wind now pushes through with sharper blades. You wedge another log against the base to reinforce the lower part, the coldest part, completing the barrier just in time for another gust of frigid air to slam into it. The windbreak shudders, but holds. As you turn back toward the fire, you hear something new. Something that sends a small ripple of unease through your chest. A distant, rhythmic crunch. Then another. Then another. Footsteps, but slow. Heavy. Measured. You sink reflexively into a crouch. The fire now behind you. The forest once again forcing your senses into razor focus. You listen carefully, comparing the sound to what you've learned tonight. Not a boar, their steps are more erratic. Not a deer, too heavy. Not a wolf, too slow. Not a lynx, too rhythmic. And then it hits you. This is a tree losing branches. The cold is so fierce that upper limbs are snapping under frost weight, dropping onto the forest floor at random intervals. Medieval hunters feared nights like this because the cold didn't only threaten from the air, it threatened from above. Falling branches were a real danger, sometimes breaking silently, sometimes shattering like icy spears. You glance up at the pine sheltering you. Its branches are thick, strong, already weighed down with earlier frost but not groaning under the strain. Still, you reposition your bedding slightly farther from the trunk. Just in case. A small precaution, but an important one. Returning to your fire, you notice the flames have recovered slightly, burning steadier now that the new logs have dried enough to catch. You warm your hands, grateful for the soft sting of returning heat. But you know this warmth won't last unless you help it. Medieval hunters rotated logs constantly on nights like this, rolling damp sides inward, flipping burning pieces to expose drier surfaces, feeding the fire with small sticks to maintain the intensity. You mimic this now, gently turning one of the thicker logs with a stick. It shifts and collapses inward, sending a burst of warm sparks upward. The forest lights up for a moment, like stars flickering to life across the clearing. The frost on the nearby trees glitters brilliantly before fading back into darkness. You exhale slowly. The fire feels stronger. Your shelter holds. Your cloak is warm again. Your stones still radiate faint heat against your stomach. And yet, the night isn't done with you. Because now you feel it, a subtle dampness creeping through the edges of your bedding. Not enough to soak, but enough to chill. Frost melting and refreezing, moisture settling, a silent enemy. You shift your weight, lifting part of the bedding to shake off frost. Pine needles fall in a dry cascade. You add more layers, pulling fresh branches from your stack, building up a thicker buffer between you and the hungry cold beneath. Hunters did this constantly throughout the night, adjusting, reinforcing, improving. 6 hours in the cold was a battle. 8 hours was a negotiation. 10 hours was a test of will. You feel that truth in your bones now. But as you settle back onto your bed, cloak drawn tight, fire thriving once again, you realize something important. You've kept the cold at bay. Not defeated it, never defeated, but held it off with the same fierce determination medieval hunters used for centuries. The frost may thicken. The wind may sharpen. The branches may crack like distant thunder. But you're here. You're warm enough. You're watching the firefight for you. You're adapting as the hunters did, one small, stubborn adjustment at a time. And the night, though unforgiving, has not broken you. Not yet. The forest has become a cathedral of frost. Every branch, every needle, every blade of winter grass glitters under the moon's pale glow like fragile glasswork. Your fire continues its steady crackle, a small defiant heartbeat in the vast emptiness of the cold. You adjust your cloak, shift your bedding, and breathe slowly, because the cold snap is still deepening, settling into the earth like a long, icy exhale. And then, through the thick stillness, you begin to notice something subtle, something medieval hunters relied on far more than we do now. The moonlight has changed. You tilt your head back, peering through the branches. The moon hangs low and bright, framed by a halo of icy mist. A soft ring encircles it, like a pale crown. Medieval hunters believed the moon foretold weather, danger, direction. A silent guide in a world with no lanterns beyond the ones you built yourself. Even now, the moon feels like a guidepost, a silver compass suspended above the sleeping forest. You rise slowly, your joints stiff, your cloak heavy with cold but still warm on the inside. The fire stays behind you, flickering orange against the trunks while you step a little farther into the light. The cold meets you instantly, sharp and eager, but the moonlight pulls you forward with its calm glow. The forest looks different under a full moon, less like a series of shadows and more like a soft painting brushed over with silver. You can see the contours of the land, the rise and fall of snow-dusted roots, the subtle path the animals used to move between trees. Medieval hunters used this visibility to their advantage. They didn't simply sit still all night. Sometimes the forest itself pushed them to move. You look around, recognizing the feeling now. An instinct. A tug. A subtle sense that your current spot might not be the safest for the rest of the night. It isn't fear. It's awareness, a quiet signal the forest sends in the way the wind shifts. The way frost seems thicker on one side of your shelter. The way your fire's smoke is beginning to drift sideways instead of upward. You step back toward your fire and watch the smoke. It curls low, hugging the ground before drifting toward a narrow gap between two trees. That's the direction the wind is heading. And wind direction matters. Medieval hunters treated it like a second map. A change in wind often meant a change in weather or movement of animals. You watch closely. The smoke trails steady, unwavering, thin. This is the wind you want to avoid sleeping in front of. So you do what hunters did. You follow the moon. Not far, you're not abandoning your fire, but far enough to sense where the valley dips and where the land rises. You step lightly over the frost-crusted ground. The crunch under your boots loud in the stillness. The moon reveals everything in gradients of white and blue. A shallow dip where cold air pools like an invisible lake. A small ridge where pine trees cluster more tightly. A patch of soft soil where frost gathers less densely. Hunters looked for these microclimates, tiny variations in terrain that meant the difference between shivering and sleeping. You stop at the small rise. Just a few paces from your camp. You press a hand to the ground. Cold, but not biting. Firm, but not frozen stiff. Better. You glance back at your camp. The fire looks smaller from here but somehow braver. Glowing bright against the dark ridge of trees. Your windbreak leans slightly under frost weight. Your bedding sits in a half-lit patch of firelight. And the whole scene feels like something from a painting of lonely, rugged survival. You inhale deeply, letting the cold flood your lungs. The moonlight provides a clarity the fire cannot, a clarity medieval hunters trusted when instinct urged them to adjust their camp, reposition their shelter, or simply stand awake for a few minutes to understand the night's changes. You step back toward your bedding, brush fresh frost off the pine needles, and nestle the hot stones deeper against your belly as you lie down again. The warmth spreads slowly, anchoring you back into your nest. Now from this angle, with the moon in your peripheral vision and the fire to your side, the clearing feels balanced. Like predator and prey, cold and warmth, shadow and flame have all settled into their proper places. A breeze lifts again, and the windbreak catches it just enough to soften its bite. The frost on the branches sparkles as the air moves through them. You can see your breath rising, swirling upward, illuminated by moonlight until it dissolves into the night. Medieval hunters used the moon not just as a light, but as a clock. They judged their rest by its position. They timed their watches by its arc. They navigated terrain by which branches caught its glow. And tonight, you feel that same quiet companionship. Its silver glow doesn't warm you, but it steadies you, mentally, emotionally, instinctively. It connects you to the countless hunters who once stood in forests just like this, reading the moon's pale language to understand the world around them. A soft rustle draws your gaze to the tree line. Not danger, just movement. A deer, stepping cautiously, its coat shimmering with frost. You watch it pause, lift its head, sniff the air, then continue on its quiet, moonlit path. The moon guides it too. You settle deeper into your cloak, closing your eyes briefly but not fully. The warmth of your stones, the glow of your fire, the shield of your windbreak, and the silent guidance of the moon all gather around you, forming a delicate circle of protection. The cold is still vast. The forest still alive. The night still long. But you are not lost in it. You are aligned with it, Guided by the same moon, medieval hunters followed when the darkness pressed too tightly and the cold grew too strong. And for now, under its soft, unwavering light, you can breathe a little easier. The moon hangs steady overhead, a pale lantern watching the world without blinking. Its cold glow spills across the clearing, illuminating the frost that coats every branch and stone like a thin layer of crushed diamonds. For a moment, everything feels suspended, the air, the silence, even time itself. But medieval hunters knew this kind of stillness well. It was the kind of stillness that came before something broke. At first, you don't notice the shift. The forest remains quiet, your fire crackles softly, and the warmth from the hot stones still hums faintly against your belly. Your breath rises in slow clouds. You curl deeper into your cloak, letting the fur hug your chin, savoring the fragile comfort you've carved out in this frozen wilderness. But then the wind changes. Not in a gentle, drifting way, but abruptly. A sudden shift in direction. A sharp, cold slap from the east. The kind of wind that carries weight. You stiffen. Medieval hunters had a name for that wind. Storm breath. The first warning touch of a coming winter squall. You sit up slowly, every sense heightened. The forest responds to the shift too. The branches above you begin to sway, not with the lazy rocking of earlier gusts, but with a low, groaning resistance, as though the trees resent the wind's command. Another gust follows, stronger, colder, wetter. You feel tiny droplets of moisture in the air, so fine they are almost mist. Your fire sputters, bending sideways under the force. Sparks skitter across the ground and vanish in the frost. A storm is coming. Not a gentle snowfall, not a passing drizzle, but a sudden, unwelcome squall, the kind that medieval hunters dreaded more than wolves. A cold storm could turn even the strongest fire weak, and even a well-made shelter vulnerable. You react instantly, the way a hunter would. You turn your back to the wind. You pull your cloak tight. You rise and examine your windbreak. The branches you arranged earlier tremble violently now. The smaller ones clatter against each other, creating a brittle, rattling song. You kneel and reinforce the lower sections with more logs, wedging them tightly into the ground. The storm wind slams into them, testing your work, pushing harder with each gust. The air grows colder, heavier, damp. Then you hear it, a distant roar from deeper in the forest. Not an animal, not a creature. Wind. A wall of wind rolling through the trees, bending trunks, stripping frost, shaking entire sections of the forest like a giant exhaling. It's coming straight for you. You rush back to your fire. Instincts lit up like sparks. The flames whip sideways again, straining to stay alive. Medieval hunters knew this was the moment to protect the fire above all else. Without it, the cold storm could end the night very quickly. You grab your extra logs, the driest ones, and stack them strategically, building a partial barrier on the windward side of the fire, not directly on top of the flames, but just far enough to shield them while allowing the fire to breathe. You reposition stones around the base to retain heat, remembering how hunters used heat wells, small pockets that kept embers alive under fierce winds. The fire steadies slightly, though its flames now dance wild and tall, shaken but stubborn. Then the storm hits. It arrives like a force made of cold claws. A blast of wind, stronger than anything you felt tonight. It slams through the trees, bending branches so hard they creak in protest. Frost shakes loose in shimmering sheets, raining down like shattered glass. Your cloak snaps behind you like a banner in battle. Your eyes sting. Your breath is torn sideways. You crouch low beside the fire, shielding it with your body, adjusting the barrier logs as the wind punches through the clearing. The fire sputters violently, but doesn't die, not yet. Then the rain comes. A sudden, needle-sharp spray, not enough to drench you, but enough to chill instantly. Cold droplets hit the fire with sharp hisses. Steam rises in frantic curls. You grit your teeth and add another log, leaning your shoulder into the wind like medieval hunters described, fighting the breath of the storm with stubborn heat. The storm shows no mercy. Wind howls. Rain flickers. Cold deepens. Your windbreak shudders violently. Your fire claws at the air like a desperate animal refusing to be swallowed. And yet, you endure. Just like they did. You adjust the barriers again, tucking your cloak tighter, keeping your face close enough to the fire to feel warmth but far enough to avoid flying sparks. Medieval hunters wrote that storms like this tested the spirit, not the shelter. You're beginning to understand how right they were. Minutes pass. Or maybe longer, the storm distorts time. Then slowly, almost reluctantly, the wind begins to ease. The rain thins. The roaring fades back into the depths of the forest. You lift your head. Your fire is still burning, fiercely, defiantly, impossibly. Your windbreak still stands, battered but functional. Your cloak is damp at the edges, but warm where it counts. And the forest exhales. A long, soft sigh of settling branches, dripping frost, and returning silence. You rise slowly, your legs stiff, your breath heavy. You add another log to the fire, not out of necessity, but out of gratitude. The flames leap up, casting golden light across your wind-scoured clearing. You settle back onto your bedding, your stones still warm enough to soothe your muscles. You pull the cloak close again, letting it reclaim your heat. The trees groan softly overhead as they adjust after the storm's violence. A few clumps of snow slide off branches, landing with muted thuds. The night is not calm, not yet, but it has returned to something like order. And as the fire glows brighter against the darkness, you feel a deep, quiet strength settle into your chest. You weathered the storm. You held the fire. You stood your ground against wind and rain and cold. Just like the medieval hunters who taught you, across centuries, that survival isn't a single act. It's a series of small, stubborn choices made in the dark. The storm has passed, but the forest hasn't forgotten it. Every branch, every pine needle, every inch of earth is dripping softly in the aftermath, releasing tiny beads of water that freeze again the moment they touch the open air. The fire burns strong now, stronger than it has all night, as if proud of having survived. You warm your hands over it, feeling the heat seep gratefully into your bones. But medieval hunters knew exactly what came after a storm like this. The cold didn't weaken. It sharpened. Cold after rain was the most dangerous kind, wet, Sneaky and relentless. Damp clothes could freeze into stiff boards. Wet bedding could suck warmth from your body faster than any icy wind. Even a trace of moisture trapped in fur could turn to frost, clinging to hair and skin like glittering needles. So now begins a different battle, one not against predators or storms, but against the cold's most cunning ally: moisture. You shift your cloak, feeling the damp edges cling slightly to your wrists. They're cold, not dangerously so, but cold enough that a medieval hunter would act immediately. You stand, stepping closer to the fire, and extend your cloak just toward the heat, not so close that it scorches, but close enough that steam begins to rise in faint wisps. You turn your shoulders, letting the fur dry evenly. Hunters did this constantly after storms, turning, rotating, airing out the wettest patches so they wouldn't freeze into stiff, unforgiving layers. Your bedding didn't escape the storm either. The top layer is damp, the pine needles cold and darkened. You kneel and lift handfuls of them, feeling moisture drip between your fingers. You shake them out vigorously, scattering droplets into the air. They freeze before they land. Medieval hunters used a simple but brilliant trick for this. They added dry material from underneath the trees, places where rain barely reached. You search for the same, moving carefully beneath the lower branches, brushing your hands along the ground until you find a patch of relatively dry needles. They smell fresher, less brittle. You gather armfuls and return to your bedding, layering them generously. As you settle the new bedding into place, you can't help but think of the hunters who slept like this night after night. Adjusting, repairing, persevering. Some accounts even mention hunters stuffing moss inside their cloaks for extra insulation. A trick that sounds slightly ridiculous until you remember how desperate a freezing night can feel. Whether that was common practice or just one particularly creative hunter's idea is something historians still debate. You pause, letting the fire warm your face. The storm feels distant now, but the cold remains razor sharp, slicing through the clearing in thin currents of air. You tuck a warm stone back into your cloak, letting its heat press gently against your stomach. The other stone is cooling, so you place it near the fire again, watching it darken as it absorbs the flame's warmth. Then a thought strikes you, one medieval hunters relied on constantly. Movement creates heat. Not frantic movement, not panicked flailing, but small, deliberate motions. They understood that lying still for too long let the cold creep in. While shifting position, flexing fingers, rolling shoulders, and gently moving limbs kept blood circulating. You stretch your shoulders beneath the cloak. Slowly. You roll your wrists. Flex your toes inside your boots. Let your legs bend and straighten beneath the bedding. Your body warms almost immediately, each small motion sparking a little ember of heat inside you. You settle again, pulling the cloak around you like a heavy curtain. The world is quiet now, the kind of quiet that comes only after weather has exhausted itself. The air feels clearer, sharper, as if the storm scrubbed the sky clean. You glance upward. The moon is brighter, no longer wrapped in ice mist. Stars begin to pierce the sky in faint clusters, shimmering through gaps in the treetops. The forest begins to stir again. A soft rustle of small paws in snow. An owl fluttering silently to a new perch. The distant crack of a branch collapsing under its own frozen weight. The night no longer feels hostile, just cold. Very cold, but natural again. You close your eyes briefly, feeling the fire's warmth on one side of your face, the chilled air grazing the other. That's when another memory from medieval hunter lore slips into your mind, a small, lopsided smile tugging at your lips. They believed that the cold had a personality, that it learned from your habits, that it waited for your mistakes, that it crept closest when you were drowsy or distracted. So hunters developed their own quirky habits, flicking fingers rhythmically to keep warmth alive, humming songs so quietly only they could hear them, telling jokes to the fire to keep it awake, and occasionally muttering insults at the cold itself, calling it a lazy wolf, or a thin-boned spirit, or something else entirely unprintable. You imagine yourself joining those hunters, whispering toward the darkness. Not tonight. It feels strangely empowering. You shift your bedding again, pulling the driest layers beneath you, letting the warm stone radiate heat through your middle. The cloak hugs you like a thick, protective shell. The windbreak stands sturdy, frost-covered but solid, and your fire, your stubborn, loyal fire, still crackles fiercely, refusing to let the night swallow it. Then, as you begin to settle, you hear a faint clinking sound. Metal? Stone? No, ice. A small curtain of icicles from a nearby branch crashes to the forest floor. Shattered by the wind's lingering breath, the sound rings like tiny bells. You exhale slowly, not startled, just aware, alert, present. Medieval hunters lived by this rhythm, responding to danger, absorbing it, adapting to it. And now you're doing the same. The storm tested your shelter. The cold tested your resolve. The damp tested your preparation. And you met every challenge with the same quiet intelligence the old hunters carried into their long, dangerous nights. As you recline once more against your pine needle bed, fire at your side, warm stone against your chest, you understand why they survived so many winters. Not by strength, not by luck, but by a kind of stubborn cleverness, the instinct to outthink the cold. Moment by moment, the night isn't won, but it's yours again. And the forest, for now, respects that. The fire burns with a steady confidence now, its orange glow pulsing against the frost-gray world around you. The worst of the storm has passed, leaving behind a forest that glitters like it has been dipped in powdered starlight. Your cloak is warm again. Your stones are heating quietly beside the fire. And your bedding, refreshed with dry needles, feels almost like something a reasonable person might choose to sleep on. But medieval hunters understood something you're just beginning to appreciate. To survive the cold, you don't fight nature. You learn from it. And tonight, that lesson becomes clearer than ever. You shift on your bedding, pulling the cloak tighter as you observe the forest in its post-storm stillness. The air is sharp, yes, but it carries a different silence now, not tense, not foreboding, but watchful. You hear small noises again, the delicate scamper of something tiny, the flutter of wings shifting on a high branch, the faint, rhythmic snuffling of an animal foraging under snow. The forest's smaller inhabitants have woken. And as you watch them move, you feel a strange sense of insight dawning, a recognition that medieval hunters relied on more than instinct, more than preparation, more than clever tricks with stones and windbreaks. They watched the animals. They copied them. They survived because nature itself was their teacher. A soft rustle draws your attention toward the bushes. A small reddish shape appears, a fox. Snout lowered, tail curled around its feet like a fluffy scarf. It sits there quietly, surveying the clearing with calm intelligence. Then, without hesitation, it curls its body tighter, wrapping its tail snugly around itself until it forms a compact, self-heating circle. You blink. That's exactly how your cloak works when you tuck your knees and elbows in. You mimic the motion now, drawing your limbs inward. Immediately, your core warms. Medieval hunters noticed this too. They admired foxes for their ability to conserve heat through tight curling and minimal movement. Some accounts describe hunters saying, "Sleep like a fox and you'll wake like a man." Whether poetic or practical, it wasn't wrong. The fox lifts its head, ears twitching, and then trots off into the darkness, leaving you with its lesson. You glance upward next, to the branches of a sturdy oak where an owl perches. Fluffed to twice its size, its feathers puff outward, trapping warm air between layers. The owl looks both ridiculous and wise at the same time, like a stern scholar in an oversized winter coat. It stares down at you with round, unimpressed eyes before turning its head nearly all the way around. Then it tightens its feathers again, creating a perfect sphere of insulation. You adjust your cloak around your shoulders in the same fashion, spreading the fur, letting it trap pockets of warm air. The difference is immediate. The chill along your collar fades. Your shoulders relax. That's 2 lessons now. Curl inward like a fox. Insulate like an owl. You sit a little straighter, scanning the clearing for more signs of life. The storm pushed many animals into hiding. But now that the worst has passed, the forest reawakens with cautious activity. Then you hear it, the soft, rhythmic crunch of hooves on snow. A deer steps into view. Not close, not careless, but visible enough in the moonlight that you can make out the delicate rise and fall of its breath. It shakes its body once, sending a shimmer of frost into the air. Then it lowers its head and digs beneath the snow with gentle, deliberate motions, uncovering a patch of unfrozen earth sheltered by thick roots. You blink again. Of course. Medieval hunters wrote about this. Animals look for thermal pockets in the landscape, low spots shielded from wind, areas beneath heavy branches, openings near rocks that absorb heat during the day. Hunters follow deer trails not just to track prey but to find better shelter. You stand briefly, walk a few paces around your windbreak, and feel along the ground where the trees create a natural bowl. Warmer, slightly, almost imperceptibly, but real. You add extra needles to that spot, reinforcing your bedding there. A tiny adjustment, but the forest just taught it to you. Of course, not every lesson from the wilderness was flattering. Medieval hunters wrote about copying the way wild boars burrowed shallow depressions to shield themselves from wind, though sleeping like a boar was hardly glamorous. Some hunters admitted to creating foxholes or badger hollows, scooping shallow pits under thick branches to sleep in. Others watched birds perch in groups to share heat and copied the idea by huddling close with their own companions. One hunter even claimed he learned how to survive a blizzard by watching rabbits dig a quick shelter into deep snow. Historians argue whether that's true, but honestly, after tonight, you're ready to believe it. You settle back onto your newly positioned bedding, cloak wrapped around you, hot stone resting against your middle like a guardian firefly. The forest feels less intimidating now, not because it's safer, but because you're learning to read it like the hunters once did. The cold presses gently at your exposed cheek, but this time you anticipate it. You turn your head slightly. The cloak's fur catches the breeze. The warmth holds. A small bird flutters down to a low branch, shaking snow from its body. It tucks its head beneath its wing, a perfect little heat-conserving maneuver. You follow suit, lowering your chin, nestling deeper, letting your breath warm the space inside your cloak. Even now, even in this freezing wilderness, you're learning to inhabit the night the way its creatures do. You breathe softly, matching the quiet rhythm of the forest. Slow, steady, alive. Medieval hunters believed that animals carried knowledge older than any human lesson. They trusted that if you watched closely enough, the forest would teach you how to survive it, not through words, but through motion, silence, and instinct. And tonight, with fox curls, owl feathers, deer shelters, and small birds hiding their faces, you feel that ancient wisdom settling into your bones. You are not fighting the cold anymore. You're adapting to it, flowing with it, learning from it. The forest is still vast and dangerous and cold. But for the first time tonight, you no longer feel like an outsider in its domain. You feel like you belong here. Not as a conqueror, not as a victim, but as something else entirely. A student of the wild. Listening to the oldest teachers on earth, the lessons of the forest settled gently into your awareness, like snowflakes drifting onto outstretched hands. Curl like a fox, insulate like an owl, seek the deer's hidden pockets of warmth. And now, as the night thins toward its quietest hours, you feel something else stirring around you, not danger, not storm, but the slow, muted shifting of the world preparing for dawn. Medieval hunters called this time the hush before morning, when the cold becomes its cruelest, and the forest holds itself absolutely still, waiting for the first thread of daylight. You feel it immediately. The temperature dips again, sharply, silently, the same way a blade slides through cloth. The air tightens, your breath fogs more dramatically, swirling into larger, denser clouds. Even your fire begins to burn in a slightly different color, lower, deeper, more blue near the base where the flames struggle against the chill. This is the moment hunters feared most. Because the coldest hour of the night isn't the middle. It's the last. The hour right before dawn. When your body is tired, your guard slips, and the forest decides whether you've earned one more sunrise. You shift inside your cloak, pulling it closer, tucking your knees back toward your chest the way the fox showed you. The hot stone at your middle has cooled but still radiates enough warmth to matter. You place the second stone beside the fire to charge again, knowing you'll need every bit of heat you can capture. Then you listen. The forest is not silent, but it's close. Too close. Even the animals have paused, as though conserving their last reserves of warmth until the sun touches the horizon. You hear only the faintest rustles, the twitch of a branch, the soft thump of snow slipping from an overloaded bough, the distant stir of a bird repositioning itself deeper into its feathers. You lie still, watching the forest through half-lidded eyes. The moon has dipped lower now, casting an angled light across the clearing. Long shadows stretch toward you, dark fingers reaching through the frost. And then, slowly, subtly, another sound emerges. A kind of grinding crunch, rhythmic and unhurried. At first you think it's an animal, but the pattern is wrong. Too steady, too heavy. Then you realize what it is. Trees cracking in the sudden temperature drop. Large limbs adjusting to the extreme cold. Bark tightening, sap freezing beneath the surface. A forest reshaping itself as it braces for the final, brutal hour. Hunters respected this sound. They said it was the forest speaking to the frost. Some even believed the trees complained or groaned when winter pushed too hard. Though historians still roll their eyes at that idea. But listening to it now, the deep snaps, the far-off groans, you can understand how the legend began. You adjust your bedding again, instinctively moving away from an overhead branch that looks heavy with frost. Not dangerously so, but the lesson from earlier remains. Falling branches are not to be underestimated. Then another sound reaches you, a faint, breathy snort from the trees behind your shelter. You freeze. Not out of fear, but out of familiarity. This sound is no predator. No threat. Just a deer, rising from its chosen hollow after the storm. You hear the delicate rustling as it shakes frost from its coat. The soft crunch as it steps toward a patch of ground with less ice. Animals begin moving at this hour, not to hunt, but to endure. Their instinct is the same as yours. Keep warm until the sun returns. You watch the deer's silhouette drift between the trunks, its form silvered by the last sliver of moonlight. For a moment, it pauses, turning its head subtly in your direction. Its ears flick, its breath drifts in two soft plumes. It regards you not as a threat, but as a fellow traveler in the cold. Then it walks on, vanishing quietly back into the trees. A strange comfort washes through you. Medieval hunters often wrote that seeing a deer before dawn was a good omen, a promise that you'd made it through the worst of the night. Not because the deer meant safety, but because if they survived the cold, you likely would too. You settle back into your bedding, the fire warming your shoulder, the cloak cushioning your cheek. Another crack echoes through the forest, sharp, distant, but less alarming now. You adjust the fire one last time, adding a new log, watching the flames respond eagerly, curling around fresh wood like a creature regaining strength. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the darkness begins to change. The black softens into deep blue. The sharp moonlight dulls. The silhouettes of trees become clearer. The eastern edge of the sky brightens by the faintest whisper of gray. You feel it before you see it, the subtle shift in the air. Dawn is approaching. The forest knows it. The animals know it. Even the cold seems to pause, uncertain whether to advance or retreat. Medieval hunters described this moment as the forest unfreezing its breath. A slow expansion, a loosening. And you feel that now. The cold still bites, but its edges soften. The frost glimmers with a less hostile shimmer. The fire burns easier, the logs catching more readily. You close your eyes briefly, letting your body sink deeper into your cloak, savoring the knowledge that you've made it to the edge of morning. The harshest hour is fading. The darkness is lifting. And with it, the weight of the night begins to melt away. Soon, the sun will rise. Soon, light will reach your clearing. Soon, warmth, even the smallest, gentlest warmth, will return. And you will have survived a night that tried very hard to freeze you. Just as the medieval hunters did. Dawn is close now, close enough that the darkness feels thinner, looser, like a blanket slipping down the edge of the world. Your fire still burns, steady and faithful, its warmth humming softly against your skin. The frost on your cloak glitters faintly as you shift, lifting your head to look toward the east. There, just above the tree line, the forest holds the faintest suggestion of color. Not light yet, more like the memory of it. Medieval hunters lived for this moment. You rise slowly from your bedding, joints stiff but not frozen, breath drifting upward in soft clouds. The clearing looks different now, softened by the promise of dawn. Shadows retreat a little. Frost dulls into pale gray. Even the air itself seems to exhale. Less sharp, less hostile. You check your surroundings the way a hunter would. The windbreak still stands, cloaked in frost but sturdy. Your bedding, though compressed, remains dry enough to be useful. Your cloak is warm where the fire touched it, cold where it didn't. The stones, now lukewarm, rest like quiet companions near your feet. You step toward the fire and kneel, warming your hands. The flames respond to your presence, crackling brighter, as if greeting you. Hunters treated fire like a living thing, one that needed attention, respect, and the promise of a good breakfast before it faded. A soft rustling breaks the morning hush. You glance up. A rabbit darts between the bushes, stopping briefly to sniff the frozen air before disappearing again. Its speed, its alertness, both are signs. Wildlife is moving again. The danger of the coldest hour has passed. You breathe deeply, letting the realization wash through you. You survived the night. Not by brute force. Not by luck. But by thinking the way medieval hunters did, noticing, listening, adjusting. And by knowing when to move and when to stay still. You begin gently packing your camp, mimicking a routine used for centuries. Clear the fire pit, scatter the bedding to return it to the forest floor. Brush frost from your cloak. Turn your face toward the rising light. The forest shifts again as the horizon brightens, birds testing the air with tentative chirps. Branches dripping with melt from the storm's aftermath. Small creatures emerging from their hidden shelters. Every sound is softer now. Every movement slower, gentler, almost relieved. You feel the same. A pale glow gathers at the edge of the sky, stretching its fingers between the trees. Frost begins to shimmer gold instead of silver. Your fire seems almost embarrassed beside this natural light, crackling lower as though bowing to the sun. Medieval hunters often described dawn as the forest forgiving us. A poetic exaggeration, maybe, but in this moment, with warmth returning and light threading through the branches, you understand the sentiment. The forest looks less like a challenge and more like a companion waking alongside you. You sling your cloak over your shoulders, gather your few possessions, and step toward the brighter part of the clearing. The cold still lingers, but its cruelty has ebbed. It feels like the world is welcoming you back. Behind you, the fire dwindles into glowing embers. Ahead of you, the day begins. You take one last look at the spot where you faced every test of the night, the storm. The predators, the cracking trees, the freezing wind, the eerie sounds, the deep hours when even the fire seemed afraid. And you realize something important. You're leaving this clearing stronger than when you arrived. Not because the cold was kind, but because you learned how to live with it. The forest, vast and quiet, seems to nod its approval as the first true beam of sunlight pierces the tree line. You breathe it in, warm, gentle, alive, and you step forward, into morning. End of script. Sweet dreams.